interested in, I just started the recording. I was really interested, and I don't know how many of you have read her book, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And Anne has been very gracious. So without further ado, other than I want you to know that I'm trying to admit people too. No, I wanted you to know that our last names, mine is Van Gass, hers is Ann Gass, but spelled differently, she said. So I thought that was really neat. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anne, who is going to speak with us tonight.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your having me, and thanks so much to Jan for organizing this. I know it's a lot of extra work to put on something like this, and I really do appreciate it. So we're here tonight to talk about my novel. It's historical fiction. It's called We Demand: The Suffrage Road Trip. And it's based on the true story of this epic cross-country road trip that took place in 1915. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so you can follow along. I've got some great photos of the original trip. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about, hang on, get it full-sized here. I'll talk to you a little bit more about why they took this trip and kind of what it was all about. And I guess I just wanted, actually I should say before I get too much further, I want to give a shout out to my daughter, Emma Levitt, who did the illustrations. She did the front cover as well as the chapter illustrations, and I thought she did a great job. I'm going to talk a little bit more about her thinking a bit later. But so this trip in 1915 wasn't the first ever cross-country trip by automobile, and nor was it the first one ever undertaken by women. But it was, to my knowledge, the first one ever undertaken for a cause, and that cause was voting rights for women, or women's suffrage. And the whole idea of it was that it was launched by the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in late September of 1915. And 4 women leave San Francisco's Panama Pacific International Exposition for Washington, D.C. Their mission is to deliver to Congress and the president a monster petition that you can see here, that this is, how the newspapers all talk about it, is this monster petition signed by 500,000 people. And they're going to bring it to Congress and the president, and it demands an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women. That's the whole story behind it. They're supposed to arrive in D.C. on December 6th of 1915 because that's the opening day of Congress. So they have, there's a time limit. They've got to get there. And, it's worth pondering that in 1915, the U.S. Constitution explicitly recognized only men's voting rights. And it's been a really long time. Women have been talking about this, have been working on this. If you measure it just from the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848, it's 67 years. But if you more properly, as I think you should, date it back to the adoption of the Constitution, it's 126 years that women have been talking about trying to get more equality and being recognized as full citizens and having voting rights, and it just hasn't happened yet. So one of the reasons why the signatures were such a big deal was that there was no 24-hour news cycle or social media or polls or anything like that. There was the way that women could show the strength of their voices in favor of women's suffrage. Here's a map of roughly that time period. It shows you kind of where those equal suffrage states are. It's not, I don't think it's an accident that the white states are good, and those are the ones that through some sort of state action have enfranchised women, and the black states are bad. Those are the ones that haven't, and the shaded states have some form of suffrage, because one of the things that happened is the suffragists, if they knew they couldn't get a full suffrage bill through the legislature, they'd ask for presidential suffrage like Illinois had, or municipal suffrage or school board suffrage. And so a lot of states had some kind of suffrage, but they're all of the equal suffrage states are west of the Mississippi. And so this trip was sponsored, as I said, by the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. That's kind of you might have heard of Alice Paul, but in these days it was still kind of the upstart suffrage group. It had just been formed in end of 1912, 1913, and in a real break with previous precedent, with what the other suffrage group had been doing all those decades, is where they had focused on winning suffrage state by state. In the Congressional Union, the CU just wants to go for a federal amendment. They're tired of monkeying around with the states, and they're going to take a lot more. They're going to be a lot bolder and take more action. And one of the things they're going to do is punish the political party in power for failing to move the federal suffrage amendment through Congress. In 1915, that's the Democrats, because Woodrow Wilson is president, and the Democrats have majorities in both houses of Congress. So here's a graphic from the CU around this time, and it illustrates beautifully what they're up to here. They're going to harness the votes of the women voters of the West, and they say there are about 4 million of them. And if they can get them to vote as a block in the 1916 presidential election, they can determine the outcome. They can remove Wilson from office if they can all vote together and oppose him. And so here you see the glorious woman voter of the West striding across the country to come to the aid of her benighted Eastern sisters who are in the black pit of despair because they don't have equal voting rights. A couple other things to notice this modern woman voter of the West is she looks like a freaking goddess. I mean, she's beautiful, she's young, she looks really intelligent. And she's also white, and that's also not an accident. They were very careful to, they're trying to build this image of what the modern woman voter looks like, and they're trying to just kind of keep the southern states from boiling over in opposition to enfranchising their Black women residents. But they also tell them, and this is very disturbing, it's kind of damning of the suffrage movement, honestly, that you can read some of the communications and newspaper articles that they put out there, and they basically assure the southern states that, look, we're just looking for an amendment to the Constitution that prohibits using sex as a way of stopping people from voting, women from voting. But the states have the power to decide who gets to vote other than, and so, that's up to you. It's a tacit, they don't name the Jim Crow laws, but it's a tacit approval of them. And so, I think one of the things that I learned is in the course of researching this book is that, it's still unfair to tag the suffragists as especially racist, because the entire country was racist, and they were simply reacting to that reality, which I'm not saying, though, that there were no racist suffragists, because there were plenty of them. But I think it's an important point to be clear about. So anyway, that's the glorious modern women voters. So here's the plan. They're at the Congressional Union has a booth at the Panama Pacific International Exposition. That's like a World's Fair in San Francisco. They're the only suffrage organization to have a booth there. So it's a very clever move on their part, because they can position themselves as being part of this, the really exciting cutting edge things that are happening. World fairs are kind of showcases of new technology, new science, new art and music, new social movements. And they're just in the middle of that. And also millions of people come to visit the fair, and they can have them come to their booth, stop by their booth, and they can educate them about the need for women's suffrage and have them sign the petition. And that's how they get those 500,000 signatures. And they hold a lot of events and stuff during the months leading up to this trip. But so the other thing they're planning though is that they're collecting all those signatures, and they're also planning to drive them across the country to Congress and the president. And they're going to launch it from this first ever in the history of the world Women Voters Convention that they're going to hold at the convention in mid-September. And it's interesting. This comes from the front cover of their weekly newspaper called The Suffragist. And it's funny to read The Suffragist in the months prior to this trip because they have great plans. And one of them is they're going to send 100 cars across the country, all driven by women. It's going to get an enormous amount of press. It's just going to be this marvelous thing. No one will be able to ignore it. And it's just going to make suffrage front page news all over the country. And it's a great idea. Everybody loves it, but no one volunteers to go. And so, they're into mid-August and they still don't know who's going to make this trip, but they've made such a big deal out of it. And they have this whole convention coming up. What are they going to do? And then the booth one day wander these two women, these two Swedish women, immigrants, who are now naturalized citizens. And they say, oh, well, we took a ship out here and we were planning to buy a new car here in San Francisco and do a sightseeing trip on our way back to our home in Providence, Rhode Island. So we'll take, Providence isn't that far from DC, so we'll take the petitions. And it's really not clear that they understood what it was that they were getting into. And I'm going to introduce them now and just talk to you a little bit more about who they are. So Ingeborg Ginstedt she was the mechanician or the mechanic for the trip. She's 50 years old at the time of the trip. She's a radical. She's a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical labor group. And she's been involved in suffrage for a couple of years now and has actually formed her own group in Providence. And she's the president of that group. Doesn't have a lot of members though. And I think she really sees herself as a suffrage leader and wants to, thinks this trip will help kind of position herself better. And this is kind of how I describe her in the book. She rode her life like a half-broken colt, plunging from one thing to another, curious and nippy, fighting efforts to rein her in. She was always restless, alert for something new. She was a wild and grim thing in 1915, with close-set, deep blue eyes startling out from her weather-beaten nose like a prize fighter, stubborn chin. So she does indeed fix the car she fixes almost everything that goes wrong with it and changes about a dozen tires on her way across the country. But she's famously, or at least has been portrayed by history as a bad-tempered, kind of irascible individual. And it's sort of interesting that she gets tagged like that. I'm going to talk about that a little more later. So her companion is Maria Ginberg, and she's 55 years old at the time of this trip. And she actually bought the car in San Francisco. She did almost all the driving, not quite. Sometimes Ingeborg spells her, and they hired a man a couple of times, but one of the times didn't work out so well, so they never did that again. But she was a midwife and had delivered something like 2,000 babies, and so that's how she basically had her own business, and so that's how she was able to buy the car. This is how I describe her in the book. Maria was as frugal with words as she was with her money. She said both were things you couldn't take back if you used them unwisely. She liked routine and didn't look for trouble, but she could hold her own if it found her. Once Ingeborg had seen her verbally dismantle a cocky Coleman who'd tried to shortchange her on a delivery. Mostly, though, she was easygoing and steady. And actually, so she has been portrayed, in historical accounts as a very maternal, loving, and kind individual, in contrast to Ingeborg. So Sarah Bard Field was the primary kind of suffrage speaker on the way across the country. She was younger. She was about 34 years old at the time of this trip. She was kind of a hot mess. She was living in San Francisco, a divorced mother of two. The kids live with her ex in San Francisco also. She was a kind of a bohemian and a poet and a veteran of suffrage campaigns, which is why the Congressional Union wanted her on this trip, because they had confidence that she knew how to handle herself in the field and as a speaker. But she was in frail health. She'd had malaria in the summer before they left, and she had a mysterious heart ailment that caused her a lot of problems, especially at higher elevations. And so she's kind of touch and go on the way across the country. She also had other heart problems. She had a lover who was 30 years older than her, and his name was Charles Erskine Scott Wood. He was an attorney who lived in Portland, Oregon with his wife and family. And he was a serial philanderer, a believer in sort of free love. And she professed to believe in free love as well, but she really just wanted Erskine. Much of what we know about this trip comes from Sarah, because she wrote these voluminous letters to Erskine along the way. And so she's the one who really provides the blow-by-blow descriptions of what happened. And then the next person is Frances Joliffe. She's the fourth member of the group that leaves from San Francisco. She was a socialite, came from an affluent family in San Francisco, and had campaigned hard for Woodrow Wilson in 1912. And that was one of the reasons why they wanted her on this trip, because they hoped that she would be able to get them in to see the president when they got there, because they've been promising everybody that's going to happen, but they didn't have that permission lined up before they left. But she made it to San Francisco, to Sacramento, and then dropped out, and they didn't see her again until New York. So she's not featured too much in the book till right at the end. And then Mabel Vernon was one of Alice Paul's best organizers. She had graduated from Swarthmore like Alice Paul, was a couple years ahead of her, and was just had enormous capacity for work. And she would hopscotch across the country ahead of them by train, and set up rallies in larger towns and cities that they went through, and also set up meetings with members of Congress, because Congress was out of session in the fall. And so they were back in their districts by and large. And so she would set up, she would organize women to accompany the envoys in a delegation to see their member of Congress and get him to agree to support the suffrage amendment when it came up in Congress. So those are the human members of the troop. The car that they buy, I have them christen, the Swedes kind of christen her Amelia Ratu, and who was an early Swedish suffragist. And she's kind of a character in her own right. And you can see that she has room in her running boards for luggage to be stored. On the other side of the car, they'd store, there'd be like 3 tanks or jugs, one that had fuel, one that had water, one that had oil. And you can see that one thing that's missing is a top. So there is a roll-up top. It's kind of a convertible, but the top kind of tends to trap the fumes, so they run with it down as much as they can. And they're leaving San Francisco at the end of September, and they're heading across the high plains of the West at higher elevations, and then they're going to end up in New England and the Northeast in November and December. It's going to be cold, and the car has no heat and of course no air conditioning. It's hot in the desert at the outset. So they're going to take the Lincoln Highway most of the way. This is the rough course of the Lincoln Highway. They depart from it on these bright red lines. They go south through Colorado and Kansas, and then up to Detroit, and then across New York, and then down the East Coast to DC. So that's the plan. They leave San Francisco without a map, and have some problems in the desert, crossing the desert in Nevada, especially the what's called the Great Basin in eastern Nevada. And I don't know if you've ever driven through there, it's quite an experience, even as I retraced their route in 2015. And I also had a new car, but it had heat and it had air conditioning and better shocks, and the roads were a lot better, and it was still just overwhelming. I don't know how they made it, but they do. And here they are in Salt Lake City. And this is very typical of the kinds of rallies they would have. This is on the steps of the capital of Utah in Salt Lake City. They would wear their sashes that had the purple, white, and gold colors of the Congressional Union. And you can see that Ingeborg here and Maria look a little burnt, a little fried by their trip across the desert. You know, they would invite try to get to these rallies as many public officials as they could. At this one, they happened to have the governor, as well as the mayor of Salt Lake City, and several members of Congress. So this was a particularly, you know, successful rally. So they continue on through out of Nevada and into Wyoming, and across southern Wyoming to Laramie, up across a pass into Cheyenne, and then through down and through over to Denver. And they stop in Denver. They're there for a few days, but they're just busy constantly. There's all these different events planned. And so by the time they get to Colorado Springs, they're fried, and you can just see them in this picture. I absolutely love this picture because they just look like they're going to kill each other. And I don't know if you've ever been, you know, on a long trip, even if it's with somebody you love. There are times when you just want to kill them. You know, you've just been with them too much for too long, and they're just exhausted. So they do get a rest day or two in Colorado Springs, and then they continue on down to Pueblo and across sort of southern Colorado and into Kansas, and they're on their way to Hutchinson, Kansas, and they get stuck in the mud at night. And this is not their car, of course. I mean, it has a top and everything, but it's from that era. On my way across the country, I stopped and did more research at libraries and historical societies, and so I got this picture from there. And you can just imagine what this would have been like. It had been raining for a couple of days, and it was just nasty, cold rain. I mean, they're into October by this time, and they get stuck at night. And Sarah, depending on which account you hear or read, she walked anywhere from 1 to 3 miles back to this farmhouse they had passed earlier, where she could find. She rousted the farmer and got him to hitch up his mules and come tow them out of this mud hole. So they do extricate themselves, but if you want to find out kind of what happens to them and the rest of the trip, and if they make it to DC on time, you'll have to read the book to find out. So I learned about this trip in the course of writing my first book, which it was about my great grandmother, who was a suffrage leader in Maine back in the last 5 or 6 years of the campaign for voting rights. And so here's the front cover of that book. And I always thought when I read about this, because it's frequently mentioned in suffrage histories of this time period, but it only gets a paragraph or maybe a page or two at most. And I always thought that must have been one hell of a trip. So that's why I decided, I would retrace their route, which I was able to do in 2015. But I was also very interested that Sarah Bartfield is always kind of held up as the hero of the story, and Ingeborg's always described as kind of nasty tempered, and when she's mentioned at all, I mean, sometimes the Swedes aren't even mentioned, and I always thought, like, what's up with that? I mean, why didn't they? I mean, if you held a gun to my head, I couldn't fix a car, and I just thought it was remarkable. This 50-year-old woman was the mechanic for this trip. I mean, she should have gotten some love for that, it seemed to me. so I just that sort of piqued my curiosity as I did the research, the background research for this book, and I'm interested to find out that people who've read this book often tell me, well, like, I don't really care that much for Sarah, but I really like those Swedish women. So it matters who tells the story, right? So that's been a fun thing for me to experience. The Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warns of the danger of the single story. She says the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And until the last 5 or 10 years or so, the single story that had been told about the suffrage movement was from the perspective of white, middle-class women, mostly affluent women, or women like Sarah, and it was incomplete. But thanks to pushback and research from people of color and their allies, we're starting to have a much more kind of nuanced and richer understanding of the US suffrage movement. It's really exciting to see that happen. So as I mentioned, in 2018, or in 2015, I spent 8 weeks retracing their original route. And the question kept coming up for me. I mean, whose history was this? It wasn't Black history. It wasn't Indigenous history. They weren't even citizens yet. They didn't get citizenship until 1924. It's not Hispanics or Asians, because you don't see them on the stages either. And not particularly, I mean, there's been some research done in labor history and working class women being involved, but not that much. So that pushed me to tell another version of the suffrage story. And ultimately I wrote a novel because it was the only way I could think of to get away from the single story and tell this from the perspective of the 2 Swedish women who'd been kind of silenced and othered. They weren't allowed to speak on this trip across the country because they looked kind of frumpy. They didn't dress in stylish clothing like that young, Greek sort of goddess. And they spoke English with a funny accent. And there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment at the time. So I think also the CU didn't want to feature them in that. But writing it as a novel still allowed me to pay tribute to the grit and determination of the women who made the trip and the suffrage movement that launched it. So I wove together fact and fiction using the history of the actual trip as my training wheels. I even went to Sweden. I tried so hard to track down information about the Swedes, but I just couldn't find out enough information about them to write it as nonfiction, which was my initial intent. So I created their characters around the little that I was able to find out. So here are some examples of how I did this. We know from the census that Ingeborg and Maria lived together from at least 1895, so I made them romantic partners. Obviously, they weren't shouting that from the rooftops, and there's no documentation of it, but those kind of Boston marriages were fairly common in the early 20th century. But usually, more often, where 2 affluent women, unmarried women, lived together. So it may have just been that, but there was definitely a queer element in the suffrage movement. So that's the way I wrote it, and but it's not something that they share with everybody. So as I mentioned, Sarah and Mabel described Ingeborg as irritable. I chose to reframe Ingeborg's irritability as justified, because even during the trip, she and Maria were erased from this story. For example, newspaper coverage would only announce the arrival of Sarah and Frances, even when Frances had been gone for weeks, because the CU didn't know when she would come back. And so they kept pretending that she was on the trip, and they would show up in a city and they'd say, oh, wait, well, she had to just take off. She had to go back to San Francisco to take care of somebody. And that's why she's not here. So acting like it had just happened. But so I don't know. I mean, that would make me a little cranky, I think. Here, these are great photos because you can sort of see how they don't quite fit the mold of some of these other women. I mean, look at Ingeborg's hat, for example. I mean, it's not the latest style. It's probably pretty functional and warm, but and at least Maria has kind of a fur cap on, but they're just definitely not in the latest style. And here's another. I think this is one of the only pictures of Ingeborg with a smile on her face. I think they're I can't remember if they're in Chicago or Denver here. But so here they are. So anyway, I mean, it would make me kind of cranky to be erased from a story in which I'm playing a pivotal role. So maybe it would make me, I don't know, reach out to Swedish language newspapers and write a completely different story, which is that it's all about Ingeborg and Maria, and Sarah and Frances aren't even mentioned. So that actually happens. I wrote it into the story, but I tracked down Swedish language newspapers from that era and found these. This is a translation. Found these stories where indeed Sarah and Frances aren't even mentioned. It's all about the Swedes. So I thought that was hilarious. I don't know that it was Ingeborg who did it, but I mean, who else would do that? And I think that another factor, and I don't make a huge deal about this, but what if she's 50 years old? What if she was in menopause? I mean, that could make you cranky, right? I mean, you're not sleeping well, you get hot flashes at inopportune moments, like when you're crossing the desert, it's at 100 degrees. It could be that was part of what was going on. So I kind of wrote that in as well. So there's no record of Ingeborg and Maria having had side meetings with anyone else along the way. But I thought it would be interesting. It was an opportunity to kind of weave in other stuff that was happening at the time, real events that would have been the backdrop of their trip. And so one example of this is Joe Hill. You might have heard about him. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, that famous song. And he was actually in Sugar House Prison in Salt Lake City when they came through along that way. And he was also a Swedish immigrant. And he was also a member of the Industrial Workers of the World. And so I'm certain that Ingeborg would have known about him. He was all over the newspapers because he was in prison for having murdered a grocer. And it's, in retrospect, it seems likely that he never did it, but he was just the scapegoat. And they used it as an opportunity to lock up this troublesome immigrant labor activist. So he was just weeks away from being executed when they came through Salt Lake City, and I had Ingeborg meet with him. When they get to Chicago, I have them meet with Ida B. Wells. Again, she's an African-American woman. She is amazing. She's a journalist. She's had to move to Chicago out of the South because of threats on her life for her anti-lynching activism and her, just organizing for, to support people of color, Black people. And, but she's not invited to be on this trip. She's not in the car, and she gives them a piece of her mind when they meet with her. But they, Ingeborg's really, is interested in what she's doing and really respects her and wants to meet with her, and that's why they do it. But I mean, it serves to highlight how segregated this trip really was. And then finally, Clarence Darrow is another name you might recognize. Interestingly, he really was the lover of Sarah Bard Field's older sister, Mary. They've been lovers for several years. I think by this time that their relationship was broken off, but he lived in Chicago. So I thought, what the heck, maybe they should, and Ingeborg, he did a lot of representation of labor activists and African Americans who were, kind of railroaded on various trumped up charges, and had a lot of respect at that time, even as he took other cases that were, a little weirder, but or a little less, noteworthy. So they meet with him in Chicago as well. So I want to talk a little bit more. I guess I just will note that the book includes an afterword where I go to some pains, I guess, to try to separate fact from fiction. And people have told me they really appreciate that, because I did incorporate so much fact into the trip, but I had to make up some stuff along the way as well. And so it's helpful to know what really wasn't. And when I did my trip in 2015, Donald Trump hadn't yet been sort of anointed the Republican nominee for president, although he was getting a lot of attention. And So as I came across the country, there was a lot of hope that Hillary Clinton would be our first woman president. Sadly, that was not to be. But as I was working on the book, before and after Trump was elected, there was a tremendous amount of anti-immigrant and anti-labor and misogynistic sentiment coming out of the Trump administration and Trump himself. And so my research was showing me that 1915 looked a lot like 2015, 2016. And that's kind of incorporated a lot of that in the book as well. I want to return to these petitions, which are such a big part of the story. For me, they're a potent symbol of how long and hard women had to work to win voting rights, and how uncertain the future of the movement was for these suffragists in 1915. I mean, they didn't know, is it going to take us 1 more year, 5 more years, 25 more years? I mean, they thought they were close, but they had no idea. The petitions also remind me that as frustrating as it must have been for them, in the US, their work was always peaceful. They never broke windows or blew things up or attacked the Capitol like happened on January 6th. It was really quite extraordinary. And so as Ingeborg reflects on the petitions, it occurred to her that the pages of all the many petitions gathered over decades from white women and colored from Eastern or Western states by Susan B. Anthony and countless others would stretch for hundreds of miles. And every page would have carried the hopes and dreams of both the signers and the collectors. What a wretched waste of time it all had been, she thought, suddenly angry. Surely the generations of women who had worked so hard to reach this moment could have set their hands to some better purpose. How many more petitions would be required to end this one battle? And so the petitions weave through different groups of women over time and ultimately become the road under the wheels of Amelia in this graphic that Emma designed for the front cover. So this is a book about a journey on many levels. Here's the fabulous four, I think, at the end of their journey. You know, it's a journey about the 1950, or it's a story about the 1915 trip itself. It's a story about the journey that the suffrage movement took to get to this place in 1915. And the journey reflects the individual, or the story reflects the journeys the individual participants took and how it changed them, because it did change them. How could it not? And though I'm not in the story myself, it reflects my own journey, which I'm still on in understanding this history and its connections to the present. So if you aren't familiar with the wording of the 19th Amendment, here it is. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any states on account of sex. What a simple statement. And this is what took, over 72 years from the Seneca Falls Conference, or 132 years, I think, from when the Constitution was first adopted. Kind of crazy. Here's a quote from Alice Paul that I just loved. She says, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." And we're still working on that because the Equal Rights Amendment has never been ratified. We now have the requisite 38 states, but it's held up in Congress, hasn't yet been certified. So that's a big deal, I think. So here are some things that you can do to support the voting rights and equal rights for women, and you can spread the word about this history and talk about your own memories or experiences with sex discrimination, or what you remember being told by your ancestors about this fight, and share that with your nieces and nephews or kids or grandkids or whoever they might be. So thanks for coming on this journey with me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can kind of go to discussion.
Thank you very much, Em. Without giving away the whole story, right? I wanted to ask you some specific things. Now, why don't we do it this way, that you use the raised hand feature, which is under reactions. Just raise your hand, or physically raise your hand. It's just hard for me to see all of you. So questions that you might have. Sharon.
I guess I wanted to ask Anne, how did she decide to write this story? You mentioned your great-grandmother, was it, that was a suffragist? And what made you take on the journey yourself, both physically and writing the story?
Well, there were a couple, it's an interesting question. I mean, there were a couple of reasons. Actually, my mom died in 2014, and so I was no longer tied to Maine, and I could take the trip, and I was her executor, and it was hard. So and I had finished my first book about my great grandmother. So all of those things had been sort of the prerequisites of being able to take this trip. I needed to know that Mom would be okay one way or another, and I had to finish my first book. So I was able to do that, and then I thought, well, 2015 is 100 years after the original trip, and it just seemed like the right time to do it. And so I had some time. I had to, I basically took a sabbatical. I even though I'm not an academic, I had to pause my consulting business, and gave me time to give my clients a heads up that I wasn't going to be around. And I just felt like I needed another project, and I was totally sold on this trip. I don't know why it just grabbed me.
Please notice in the chat too, if you have not read the book and want to purchase it, that you can order it through your local bookstore, but also find it at Maine Authors Publishing, and the link is there. It's also on Amazon, but I ordered it, I believe, through Maine Authors Publishing, so I wanted to support that group. Can you talk a little bit about that group, Anne?
Yeah, Maine Authors Publishing is a small Maine press, and so that's who I ended up. I actually published both books through them, and it does have a self-publishing arm to it, but this, as a small press, it also acts like any other small press. I mean, there's an editing process and stuff like that you have to go through. So it was a good experience.
Other questions? Yes, Phyllis.
I was interested in more of your research. Apparently you found written documents and historical societies, because you didn't speak Swedish, I know, when you went to Sweden.
Yeah. I started out with looking at the letters that Sarah Bard Field had sent to Erskine, her lover, and they're out at the Huntington Museum and Library out in Pasadena, California. So I flew out there and looked at those, and then that helped me. I also you can get on microfilm correspondence or any documents from the National Women's Party papers. The Congressional Union in 1917 becomes the National Women's Party. They changed their name, and so those papers are at the Library of Congress, but you can get them on microfilm. They've been sort of their repositories around the country on microfilm, and so I had those sent up to Maine, into Portland, Maine, and looked at them in the library up there. So that gave me a chance to read all the correspondence around the trip, and then gave me the itinerary and all kinds of different things like that. And then I did, read all the issues of the Suffragist, and did a lot of background reading on both suffrage and other early 20th century history, a lot of Swedish history, actually, Swedish immigration history, because I was curious about the Swedes, both what might have prompted them to emigrate in the first place, and then kind of what would it have been like to come to the United States at that time.
Victoria, it is in the chat if you just scroll up a little bit. Can you see it?
Yeah,
or we can retype it.
Yeah, I just reposted it. Yeah.
Okay, great. there other questions or things you'd like to know? I was so interested in the seance scene. I thought that was just incredible for those of you that have read it.
Yeah,
I know
my
that
original-
was not, factual, but
right, that didn't happen. But when I was writing this, my original thought was, wouldn't it be fun to have a book where the suffragists and in every major city, got highlighted, or every state. And I started doing that, but then I realized there's only so many times that you can write, well, they drove hard all day and then they got to the city and they met with these suffragists. And I just started realizing like everybody's going to be just yawning and throwing the book into the trash after, a little while. So I wanted to spice it up a little bit. And that's also though based a little bit on some history, because the spiritualists were some of the early suffragists. They were able, they were viewed as sort of leaders in a way because they could speak with the spirits from the other world, and they were, self-employed. They were supporting themselves off their work, and so they were a bit on the leading edge there. So I thought it'd be fun to highlight that, and it allows me to sort of bring in Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yeah, I like that part. Can you talk a little bit about, how you originally started with your research, et cetera, and you were going to write nonfiction and how that evolved?
Yeah, I actually started out writing it as nonfiction because I'd done all this research. I mean, it was like a ridiculous amount of research to write a novel. But then I started realizing I just didn't know that much about the Swedes, and I couldn't, probably some smarter person could have figured out how to do that anyway. And there's ways to do it. Like I could have put myself into the story more, but I really didn't want to do it that way. And I started thinking, my first book is nonfiction, and I had people tell me, oh, well, I don't really read nonfiction. And so I thought, well, maybe I could, attract a different audience and one that isn't as familiar with the story if I wrote it as a novel. So, I guess I'm always up for a challenge. So I've never written a novel before. It took me a while to figure out how to do that. And it seemed like the right thing to do. And it allowed me to, take what I knew about the Swedes but kind of riff off of that and create these characters.
Do you have plans to write more books, or where are we at with that?
Well, I do have, I always have plans. That's my problem. I got too many of them. But I registered today as a candidate for state rep in my district. And so that's going to take up some time between now and November. But I do have, one of the things I've learned about along the way is that Maine was one of the 32 states in 1917, 1918 that embraced what was called the American Plan, which was it was a response to the fact that a lot of something like, I can't remember, 10% or some larger portion of US troops showed up in World War I at training camps with venereal disease. And so the American Plan basically was designed to try to curb that by giving public health departments police powers that allowed them to lock women up and forcibly test and treat them for venereal disease. And tens of thousands of women were locked up and forcibly treated in the next 50 years. The last case was in Seattle, I think, in the 70s. And it was never successfully, no woman ever won a lawsuit over this. And that is, those laws, that's not so much the laws I think have been repealed, but that precedent, that legal precedent is still on the books. And so anyway, I think that's history that's not well known. And I thought I might try and write a novel about that, but Yeah, I'm not fast at this writing stuff. I'm too much of an activist. I currently serve as vice chair of my town council, and I'm just always, it's hard to keep my butt in a chair long enough to actually write anything.
Well, and that's very exciting also that you're moving forward and running. And really, I don't know how much you know about AAUW. I mean, obviously, we are non-political, or we are political but nonpartisan. But I think many, really right now, voting rights is certainly one of the major issues. And
Right.
so I think the most important thing, obviously, is that we all vote, but also that we're really standing in the way of rights for people in terms of voting. So,
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Sharon.
I'm interested as a Detroit native, the car capital of the US, how these ladies had bought this car in 1915 when Henry Ford had just started making cars in, 1909, 1910, whatever. Did you find out if they drove the car from Rhode Island to San Francisco and back? Or did they, and why would they pick up a car in San Francisco when Rhode Island is so much closer to, or were they just coming from, and even Sweden is not on that side of the United States. So any idea of how this all happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they wanted to go to the Panama Pacific, and they had explored Europe some. They'd done some trips to Europe and back to Sweden, but they had never explored the U.S. So they took a ship out to San Francisco, and then they planned to buy a car in San Francisco and drive it back. And so there was this company called the Willis Overland company out of Toledo, Ohio, I think. And they, there were actually at that time, it wasn't like the big three automakers. There were like, 50 automakers around the country. I mean, there was a lot of them. And so market share, grabbing market share was hard. And so this Willis Overland a company actually advertised, planned to have a car that would be a special for the Panama Pacific. They advertised heavily. They brought a lot of cars to the Panama Pacific. And they even had Swedish language advertisements that they put in those Swedish newspapers. And I think the circulation of the Swedish newspapers was like the third highest in the country behind, of course, English and then German, and then it was the Swedes. And so there were actually dozens and dozens of these Swedish newspapers around the country at that time. And so I think they must have seen it in a Swedish language newspaper. I mean, they could read and write English. They were literate in English, but they'd seen it advertised and it kind of fit their needs. And so that's what they drove back.
Well, most people at that time also took the train, and they would stop at the national parks or what was, to be the national parks. And then how did the one lady who was the advance person, how did she communicate with the ladies in the car, since there was certainly a lack of communication compared to now,
Yeah, I mean, she would send them telegrams. Primarily, or she would leave letters for them at the hotel. Like when they caught up to where she had been, she would leave messages for them, but she also would wire them back and forth. And that was kind of wiring people was expensive. It was also you had to be careful what you wrote in those, because they were kind of public. The telegraph operator could read them and steal your secrets. That's a good question. And actually in Sarah's letters and in the correspondence of the National Women's Party, you actually see, that letters go awry, like letters between Mabel and the national office in DC, or, Alice Paul, wherever she was traveling, and money becomes an issue because Mabel's out of money and she needs, but the letters keep missing her. And so it definitely, communication was tough because there were telephones at that time, but there were only a handful of them and only in the larger cities.
In the book, do you address how the ladies were treated? I mean, on the road, how were they treated in the small towns? I wonder how they were treated, the fact that they were suffragettes or suffrage women. Were they sort of booed down at times, or because they were going through hostile territory in all reality?
Well, I mean, but remember that all, west of the Mississippi, those were all equal suffrage states. So they were treated as kind of heroes there in those states. They got a lot of love. And then as they progressed further across the country and into states where women didn't have the vote yet, yeah, they encountered more opposition and some heckling. But I never got the impression, if it happened a lot, didn't seem to bother them. I mean, like Sarah didn't include a reference to it much in her letters, and there's not much in the Suffragist or other correspondence. So I think what ends up being more of a problem for them, actually, not so much the anti-suffragists, but the other suffrage organization, that what I sort of often refer to as the legacy suffrage organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, because those women, yes, they're pro-suffrage, but they're also much more conservative socially, and they don't like this political activism. They hate it, and they lose no opportunity to complain about it to the press and vilify the Congressional Union and Alice Paul. And it's pretty stark, reading that correspondence, how nasty they were sometimes. In contrast, Alice Paul, she always said, I'm not going to fight with women publicly. And she didn't. I mean, her letters are always just a model of professionalism. And she, when she disagrees with them publicly, she is courteous about it, and she just says, here are the facts, or here, this is the way we look at it, and she would just proceed. She wouldn't say, they're terrible and we hate them. And so I think that was more of a problem for them, because in some cases they would come to a city and they would find that the hall that Mabel had rented was not available to them, because the NASA women would have swept in and said, shut this down. We don't want them to have a public event in our town. And so that ends up being a little more of a problem.
I have a quick question for Jan Van Gass. Will this program be available to the branches, so when they have book clubs that they could view it in some ways?
If I do a good job with the recording, yes. That's qualified. There also was a comment about the note cards. And I don't know, Anne, if you're familiar with Menezee Wall, but she's just done some beautiful work. She has a book, but also these cards about suffrage. And but we're also, I want you to know that those are featured on our homepage of AAUW of Michigan, that we actually are selling them also, in consort with Menezee. So please order them that way. Leah has her hand raised.
No, I was wondering if Anne could tell us what happens to some of the main characters after the events in the book.
Good point.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's see. I mean, I'll start with Maria and Ingeborg, I guess. Maria actually commits suicide in 1921. We don't know why she did it, but she left all of her property. She owned a property in Rhode Island and the car, of course, and whatever other assets she had, she left to Ingeborg. Interestingly, two of Maria's siblings from Sweden reach out and challenge that, that her will, and try to get that property away from Ingeborg, but they're not successful. And that's another reason why I think they really were, lesbians, because why would she have done that to somebody she just lived with? I don't know. I mean, it seems like she might have chosen a blood relative over somebody who was just a roommate. Ingeborg continues to live in Providence and then goes back, and I think the mid-30s or so, and goes back to Sweden. She retires there, and she dies in the mid-50s. Let's see, Mabel, as I said, her health was never great after that, but she continues to campaign for suffrage until it's won. I think Mabel actually was also lesbian, although she was in a phase in her life where she didn't have a romantic partner at that time, but she later lives with a woman. Sarah Bartfield stays in the East for some time. She's kind of, in a way, she still really loves Erskine. She doesn't believe he's ever going to leave his wife and marry her, or even just move in with her. And so she needs to earn a living. So she finds some work in the East. And then 1917, she goes back to San Francisco, and Erskine comes down to see her and convinces her to buy a car. And they're out driving in the mountains one day with her kids in the back seat. And this was against the rules because her ex-husband, who was a minister and kind of conservative, just had forbade her to ever see Erskine in the presence of her children. So they sneak away, and they're doing this picnic in the mountains, and the road gets really narrow, and she has trouble turning around, and the bank falls away. There's a big cliff on one side, and the bank falls away, and the car rolls down the bank and falls on her son and kills it. And so it's really awful, and she's just a mess. Of course, her ex-husband is furious with her. Apparently her son, by all accounts, was just a marvelous young man. He was about 17 at the time, just a beautiful young man, very sweet and smart and loving. And so it was a big, big loss. And Erskine, kind of pays for her to be in a sort of sanitarium and sits by her. She's mute for a long time, and he finally kind of coaxes her back to life. And ultimately, he does leave his wife and move in with her. They have a place south of San Francisco they call Los Gatos, and they live there. Finally, his wife, his real wife, dies, and he marries Sarah. And so they kind of live happily ever after, in a way, because he's so much older than she is that he dies, of course, long before she reaches old age. And but it kind of works out okay for her. It's interesting that I met several of her, I met her granddaughter, who was in a nursing home in Oakland when I was out there. And I also met some great grandchildren of Erskine's. And it was interesting because, as I said, Sarah's always been held up as kind of a hero for, just being this amazing liberated woman who makes this trip. And her descendants, and Erskine's descendants, are kind of like, actually that's true, but she was also a homewrecker, and she caused our family a lot of pain, and he settled a big chunk of his estate on Sarah. She inherited a bunch of money from him, and so that's it caused financial hardship for their family as well. So they don't see her as this unequivocal hero, and that really, those conversations with her descendants really helped me think differently about this story. I mean, she still is amazing, and while I don't make her the hero that other historical accounts have, I still give her some credit for sort of like growing and changing as she goes across the country, and I think that is true. I mean, I saw that in her letters, and her relationship to Erskine changes. So it's all just kind of interesting the way that worked out.
What's the background of Erskine that they kept his papers and letters?
He was an interesting guy, a little bit like Clarence Darrow. He was an attorney and had been in the military. He was actually part of the military, squad or whatever that chased the Nez Perce Indians up to the Canadian border, Chief Joseph, and eventually befriends Chief Joseph, and to the point where he sends his son to stay with the chief in the summers. And so he had that sort of interesting experience as a young man, camping in the desert and that kind of thing. But he becomes an attorney, lives in Portland, and like Clarence Darrow, he takes a lot of cases. He represents labor activists and women who are pro birth control and trying to offer birth control to other women, and just radicals of every stripe. But he also, in order to earn income and support his family, he works for like a big railroad company. And what finally allows him to retire and move in with Sarah is like this big land grab that he's able to engineer. And there he makes a pile of cash off of that. But he was he was an interesting figure in the Northwest. He's not one of the primary sort of movers and shakers that we always hear about in the early 20th century, but his story is quite interesting, and he was pretty significant. So that's, I guess, why the Huntington, and I don't know why the Huntington ended up with his papers as opposed to someplace in Oregon, but I think that's what Sarah wanted.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. This has been really enjoyable, and I'm hoping that those of you that have not read the book will purchase it or get it at your local library and read it. It's really enjoyable. But this has been a wonderful opportunity for us, and we certainly thank you very much. So it's time for
Thank you.
dinner, I
Yeah,
guess.
go have dinner. Yes, thanks so much.
Right.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right,
you.
take care. Stay well.
You have to stop the recording.